Hey there, everybody. So we're going to be looking at Chapter 2 here in World History. Um, Chapter 2, The Rise of the State in Southwest Asia and Nile Valley, 3200 to 500 BCE. What really we're looking here is pretty much Southwestern Asia, Egypt, Mesopotamia. We'll look a little bit at the Hebrews. Talk about language and a couple other things in here. So that's generally what we'll be covering in this section. All right. Written sources and human past, starting around 3200 BCE. We think writing developed around 3200 BCE, Mesopotamia, used mostly for things of like state records, for goods, very utilitarian purposes. Writing and history go hand in hand because that really is history. History begins when we have a written record. It doesn't have to be, paper. There's no paper by any means, but it could be stone, clay tablets on walls. It could be on pottery, on weapons, some type of written record on whatever type of substance. We're looking at whatever type of material. We know writings began, give or take, around this period. We know there was lots of records before this, oral records, oral histories, because suddenly things are just written down. Suddenly we have records. These didn't materialize out of thin air. So these would have been things that existed well before, and then eventually someone figures out how to write them down. All right. So many early written documents that do survive, generally it's because they were inscribed on very hard materials. Bone, shell, papyrus, bamboo, cuneiform, that's what you see there in the picture. That was Mesopotamia. It was simply wet clay that they used the sharp end of a bird feather, a quill or something, and they pushed down the symbols, these pictographic symbols, and then the clay hardens, and it's as hard as stone. Generally, these records exist because they were often recopied. We have very few things from the earliest time periods, although we have records that date back as copies from earlier times. Often inaccuracies when they recopy these, because whenever we do find multiple copies from different time periods, as with anything, if you ever played that game where like you whisper something to someone and they whisper it to another person and you go like 6 people down the line, whoever started the story, by the time it gets to the last person, the story has changed. So every time a record was recopied or translated to another language, there's always inaccuracies. But why did they do this? Well, they had to be important. They were thought to be important, whether they were stories or records or lists of victories or wars or lists of slaves or cattle. Whatever it was, they were considered important. Mesopotamia had the cuneiform, as you see here in the picture. I don't know that they did this intending for it to last thousands of years. Probably not. It was unintentional, but thank goodness it did, because this is really where history begins. I see papyrus in Egypt, silk or bamboo in China, for instance. You see things written on large stone obelisks or stelae. A stele is just like a stone column that people would write on. Pyramids, walls, you name it. Things like that. Writings that were worthy of being written down and copied again were typically something political, military, taxes, religious, law, traditions, rituals. And of course, this tells us a lot about it doesn't tell us a lot about culture per se, but it tells us a lot about just the intricacies of daily life. The laws, the government, the taxes, what people did, what jobs they had, what kind of lives they led. It doesn't give us a lot of stuff about like what the life was of, or like what. This isn't literature, generally speaking. It's really for utilitarian purposes. Records of common, regular, everyday people are also very few and far between. You have to think about that. Why? Why do we see records of common people very rare? Think about it for a moment. Maybe because there's lots of reasons. Maybe because, well, first of all, common people wouldn't have been literate. Very few people were literate. Common people were common, exactly that. They weren't really considered important. They were expendable, disposable. Lots of common people were slaves. They were all poor. And what was their life like? It was pretty boring and normal, and everybody knew what life was like to be a farmer. There was nothing special about that. The vast majority of people were farmers. So, for the most part, people who actually were in the know, who had any type of education, they didn't really care. It just wasn't important, if you will. All right. Let's look at cities. These early towns and villages eventually develop into cities, and people in cities generally thought of themselves as superior to others, superior to other people around, more civilized than those around. These societies that were considered to be, quote, civilized had things that were some common aspects. They were typically politically, economically, and socially organized. Politically, economically, and socially organized. They usually had advanced ideas of law, science, religion. There was always an educated class of some sort, some type of educated elite, someone who could read, someone who could write. Many scholars consider writing simply a requirement for civilization. You can't have a civilization without some type of writing or language system. Not just being able to speak, but actually have some type of an official language system. So that means societies that were nomadic, societies that were very agrarian, very rural, nomadic, or pastoral, might not be considered civilized. Here's the problem with civilization. While the word itself, there's nothing wrong with it, in Western civilization, America, Europe, the word sometimes could have negative connotations. It can be used improperly. In other words, we're civilized and they are uncivilized. We are advanced, they are unadvanced. Which easily leads to the next step. We are superior, they are inferior. That's the problem with talking about civilization. It inherently leads down that path to superior versus inferior, us versus them, which can lead to oppression, lead to violence, lead to warfare, lead to slavery, all kinds of things. So the word itself, there's nothing wrong with the word. There's nothing wrong with the definition of a civilization, but it has often been used improperly or used for negative purposes, if you will, by Western civilization, meaning America and Europe and white people in general. So you got to be careful with this idea. And there's another idea in there too, the idea of progress. Especially the last 500 years in the world, there's been this idea among the West, Europe, America, that we are progressing and much of the rest of the world is not progressing. We're more advanced and we're superior. You have to be careful with that because we don't use that. We're not considering that in this. When we're talking about civilization in this class, we're simply looking at simple facts that I'm going to discuss. Simple facets, what makes a civilization. It's not about superior or inferior. It's not about that. It's just simply things that allow us to define how society has been advancing and moving forward and changing over the years, over the millennia. So around 3000 BCE, there were probably hundreds of cities in the world with tens of thousands of people. Civilization. A little funny little accent came out. I don't know what I just did there. Civilization. I'm not sure what that was. Civilization in India, the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, Mediterranean, China, We have these civilizations pop up. We're going to discuss all of them in some way or another. That facets of culture, that you saw that's really, I don't know if there's anything more specific. I did miss something. I left something out. All right, so talking about culture, what we think of as ideas of culture, various facets of art, philosophical thought, theological teaching, meaning religious teachings. Today we often put together civilization and culture, that one goes with the other. Societies that don't have culture, which doesn't mean superior culture, it just means they have to have some type of art, some type of music, they have some type of religion, some type of thought or education or science before the word science exists. That's also aspects of what is required for our definition of civilization, which we can find on every continent, pretty much, at this point in time. So, all right, next thing I want to look at here. The rise of states, laws, and social hierarchies. Today the word state would probably be synonymous with country, but bear in mind, back then we're talking about things far, far smaller. Back in this time period, some states were literally just a city and the surrounding farmland, as in the picture. What we would call a city-state. It's a city, walls, some type of government and military, whatnot, and the surrounding farmland, and that's it. It might be a couple miles across. And that's an entire city-state. That's an entire society, an entire civilization. So what really creates this idea of a state? Well, when we have a segment of the population that is able to sort of coerce resources at everyone else to maintain power. In essence, getting the farmers to give the food to some type of government, and then a government offering protection for the farmers. That's sort of the beginnings of a state of some sort. The interest that gains the most power, which usually is a particular family, maybe a set of religious leaders, or maybe a single individual. Whoever is it that gains this power, family, religious, an individual, usually become the rulers. This usually becomes the elite, whether it's a king, priests, or an authoritarian. Not necessarily in a bad way. We're not necessarily talking about violent or oppressive, but some type of a central authority that is willing or able to convince others to follow them and obey them. Sometimes they ruled fairly. Sometimes they did not. These individuals or these kings or whatnot. Usually there's a strong military, police. In most of world history, the military and the police would have been synonymous. Generally, a peacekeeping force would have been the same. Only in modern times do we try to differentiate between police and military. And of course, that's necessary for multiple reasons, right? To keep the peace, but also to protect us from our enemies, or to attack our enemies, to take their stuff. That also happens. Once established, these states typically form a government, what we call our first bureaucracies. Maybe only a few dozen people, hundreds of people. Today, government bureaucracies are often in the millions, but back then, much smaller. Power was much more centralized in the hands of a few for, most of human history. Usually there's a form of taxation that comes about. You have to have taxes to pay for all of the accoutrements of civilization, defense and military, and just to pay for all the things needed, the buildings, construction, etc. Usually we have formal laws, traditions, and also a social class forms, a social structure forms, a hierarchy, if you will, always forms. Some type of social hierarchy that might be divided among a few classes or maybe many classes, usually with this ruling elite, the king, the family, the priests, usually up towards the top, of course. Typically, The vast majority of population is the low class. That doesn't mean slaves, although they all early societies had slaves. But generally a mass of poor laborers and farmers. Marriage and gender norms are often standard. Property rights are standard. Everyone has their place in these new civilizations. All male-led patriarchies. We don't really have any records of any female-led, what we call a matriarchy, in human history. Don't get me wrong. Occasionally there's a queen that'll show up, or occasionally you'll have a female ruler. But that is the exception. That is the rarity. And usually it only happens once in a generation, or once in multiple generations, and then the rest of the time it is male-led patriarchal. And even in the rare cases that we do have a female leading, as a queen, for instance, a sovereign of some sort, the government is pretty much entirely in the hands of men and patriarchal authority. Record keeping is a big part of this. Taxes, laws. We have to have officials to keep records of everything that is bought and sold, and taxes paid, and debts owed, rules, punishments, things like this. The first civilization that really did this was Mesopotamia, our little cartoon there. Mesopotamia is really the first civilization in the world. But within 1,000 years, Mesopotamia, India, China, the Greeks, other places, we see this occurring all around the world. And that leads us right into Mesopotamia. That will be our first region we're going to discuss. Now, Mesopotamia is the region, like for the U.S., North America. That's the region, the continent. Sumeria and Babylon are the actual states that developed. Two of the states, there's many, but two of the states that developed in the region of Mesopotamia. Lots of challenges: environmental, irrigation, religion challenges. These generally are city-states. So they're not huge. They're not empires. We'll talk about that, but they're really not empires. They're starting out as a couple of cities with the surrounding farmland and water. Again, 10, 20, 30 miles across. That's the entirety of their authority and domain. So small. They needed constant fresh water for their populations growing. Some of these cities grew to be 20,000 plus, which was huge at the time. When your average village had, a few dozen or a few hundred people. They had large growing populations, and so most of the time they settled in river valleys. All the early civilizations we'll talk about settled in river valleys to give them access to fresh water for growing crops, growing food, feeding and watering animals, and of course the humans themselves. The rivers that we talk about with Mesopotamia, the two major river valleys, are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. These run out of Central Asia, where all the snow is. They melt, and then all the waters come running down the river. They bring all the silt and sediment with them. And they had been doing this, by the way, for millions and millions of years. Making this, as you sometimes, I don't know if I've used the term or not, but the Fertile Crescent. Because this land had been fed by the rivers and the waters and the mountains, bringing all that dirt and sediment for millions of years. This was some of the most fertile land in the world, and so that was perfect for growing crops and taking care of plants and animals and domesticating animals and whatnot. We had to have lots of technological improvements to deal with this. Someone had to organize, control the water supply. We had canals and dikes and dams. And all kinds of tributaries built, irrigation canals. You had to do all that. Because the water would come down, it would just flow and flood. So you had to control the water, you had to control where the water went, plus you had to stop the water from going to the ocean. Because once the water reached the ocean, it was useless. Once it got the salt in it, salt water is useless. You can't drink it, you can't use it on crops. So they had to stop the water and divert off all that rainwater, or not rainwater, but snowmelt water that would come down every spring. They had to divert all that water off into the fields before it got down to the ocean. So it was a major, and maybe the most significant engineering feat of early civilization, other than perhaps the pyramids, that they were able to create these massive irrigation systems, which was thought that at one point half the population worked on these things. Half the entire population worked on building and maintaining these irrigation canals. It was just such a big deal. Water was everything, because once that water got past the cities and made it to the ocean, it was useless. In many ways, it was completely useless. So this was really what spurred early innovation, technology, engineering, math, science. Some of the mathematics developed by early Egyptians and Mesopotamians, we don't see matched in most places of the world for sometimes 2,000 years. They have to have this incredibly advanced mathematics and irrigation engineering just to do it, including building things like you see in that picture there. The ziggurat, the step pyramids, they built those. That requires lots of advances in math, science, technology, whatnot. Two of the largest cities, Uruk and Ur. I don't know if I have it. I don't guess I have it on here. I don't know why. My slides are weird. For some reason I can't back them up. It always goes back to the previous slide. Oh well. Maybe there's a setting somewhere, but hell, I really don't know. Two of the earliest cities, Uruk and Ur. You'll probably see those on a map in a moment. Might have had as much as 40 or 50,000 people. Not just in the city, but in the surrounding lands, as a result of the farming and irrigation and the crops and whatnot. We got these construction projects in addition to the canals. They built bridges and walls and public buildings, ziggurats, pyramids, these step pyramids, all this kind of stuff. They had to do all that. Much of it was for defense and protection, but much of it was also to display their power and wealth and their status. As they do today. People today still, they spend their money, the rich and wealthy spend their money on things that are useless and meaningless. 5 homes, 8 cars. It's stupid. It's an incredible waste of money while people in the world are starving to death all over the world. And then people buy their 8th car, celebrities and shit like that. It is simply a need of people that have power to display that power, and they want people to look at them in awe. And it applies today as much as it applied 5,000 years ago. It's just the way it is. So having high status, having authority, again, some of it was utilitarian. You needed a wall to defend against enemies. But a lot of it was simply about glory and status and impressing your enemies or your neighbors or your competitors. Priests would live at the top of these ziggurats, often because the idea was it was closer to God. The higher they could get, closer to the gods, which they had many, many gods and spirits. They had lots of public buildings as well, government buildings. They would have public markets. Mesopotamia was a thriving civilization, the first on Earth, most likely, we think. Priests held most of the authority. Even though there were kings, Mesopotamia had kings, most of the power and authority was thought to be in the hands of the priests. Because after all, they're the ones that could talk to the gods. They could communicate with the gods. They, of course, could get the gods' blessings and deal with the gods if they were angry, things like that. And the gods were the ones that were thought to bring the water every year. So the water would come down rushing from the mountains every year because the gods were happy. And of course, on the rare times that there was a drought or the water didn't come rushing down, that meant the gods were angry. Maybe it's time to go kill some priests or get new priests or something like that. They wanted to make sure the babies were healthy, the sheep didn't die, locust plagues didn't occur, all that kind of crazy stuff from the Bible, all the different apocalypses that occurred. The reason they're in the Bible is because that stuff actually happened. Locust plagues, things like that, which still happen today, and sandstorms that would blot out the sun. That stuff happens. It's just Mother Nature. It's what happens. There's no spirits. There's no gods. There's nothing the gods can do to stop or create locust plagues. They simply happen, and they still happen today. They did believe in sacrifice. We think they did do some human sacrifices, typically of enemies or people that would volunteer themselves to die for the state, because it was high glory, high status. high honor to be sacrificed for the state. That could also happen. Let's see, royalty, the kings and the royal family had lots of status, lots of wealth. Most of these cities had a king, even though the priests held most of the power. They had like a king, which was more like a military warlord, usually leading. These elites owned most of the land, and of course the majority of the population, who were commoners and slaves, worked the land of the elites. So even if you weren't a slave, you still didn't really own anything. The elites owned pretty much everything. There was an army that maintained authority and power in the hands of the elites. We do see laborers that every once in a while might get a piece of land. There's some evidence of some small independent farmers. What we might consider a middle class, although please be clear, even their middle class was still poor and lived in poverty generally. Taxes, most people didn't have money back then. Most of these societies didn't have an actual currency, if you will, coins. That doesn't come about for a little while. So the way you pay taxes was in food. You would give a portion of your crops you'd grow every year to the king or to the city, and they would take that from you and then redistribute it to other people who weren't farmers. Sort of a redistributive economy. That's how you pay taxes, and you also would work for the government or work for the priests, building ziggurats, building walls, building homes, building things like that. And then finally, that last thing which you saw in there said gender distinctions. Yeah, men had roles, women had roles. Also status distinctions. There was the royalty, the priests, the warrior class, and then you had commoners and slaves as well. Women, we have no records of women really having any power or authority in Mesopotamian society. We have no records of women complaining about it, but that should not be surprising. Women weren't given the opportunities. Women weren't educated. All the records that were written, whenever we can find evidence of who actually wrote something, always male. Whenever there's any evidence, which is not very common. But yeah, there's almost no records of women at all, other than in a very offhand about like a wife having kids or something. So it doesn't seem as though women were given much respect in Mesopotamian society, but it's hard to tell because there frankly isn't much evidence of any of that about women at all. Okay, so by 3200 BCE, cuneiform is a writing system that originally used pictures of objects to communicate a written message. This is a pictograph. The symbols were wedge-shaped marks made in clay tablets. It was a system that changed over hundreds of years, and only people who were the educated, what we call scribes, that probably spent years of their life studying, were able to learn to write and read and to record things, to master it. One of your sources actually talks about what it was like to be a scribe. It was tough. It was really tough. A very challenging life. Cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped, which is from Latin. Usually they're in records like this, which we find as pieces, and then they have to piece them together and try to put it together, and usually there's gaps. You might see that in some of the documents you read. You'll be reading along the document, and then it'll just stop, and there'll be like brackets, and then it will continue on. Well, that's brackets, that's what's missing. Like you look at the piece of text here in this picture, what, 20% of that document's missing? We have no idea what those words are. They're gone forever. These are just the pieces they found. Let's see. Typically only temple records, city records are written down. Eventually we see histories of people, religious traditions, or even the first literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the first literature in probably all of civilization record. Don't get me wrong. There were probably things that existed before this that were transmitted orally. But as far as an actual written record, this is the first one we have that still survives. These were often these epic poems, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which the minstrels or the bards, the storytellers, would pass down probably year after year. Some of these stories, like Gilgamesh's epic, might have been passed down for 1,000 years. before it was finally written down. The records that we have of Gilgamesh, I think, today are from around the year 2300 BCE, something like that, which means there's evidence that they were copied, recopied many times. The story goes back centuries, and there was probably earlier written records of it as well. The achievements or failures of heroes were often very common stories in early civilization. Hell, we still do today. Marvel movies, anyone? Superhero movies? Even today, we still enjoy the entertainment value of heroes and good versus evil. I mean, what the hell else is these superheroes and these like the Avengers movies and stuff? They're about good versus evil and the best of people and the worst of people, all that kind of stuff. We've always done this. It's just what we enjoy. Something about being human, our imagination. The Epic of Gilgamesh was this first epic poem. It's in your sources. There's some parts of it in there. It's about an ancient king from the city of Uruk who went on a search for immortality. It's a really great story. You could look it up on the internet and read the entire thing. It is the first great epic poem in the world history that we have a record of, a written record of. We see mathematics, we see science. Of course, they needed trigonometry, geometry to build all the things they built, to do all the engineering projects. They created a math system based on the number 6. Now, our math system today is based on the number 10. It's the decimal system. It's based on the number 10. Well, their system is based on the number 6, which we still use today. How do you think we still use that number system based on the number 6? Time, anybody? 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 24 hours. Our entire system of time is based on the Mesopotamian math system. Yeah, it is. And there's lots of other things we get from the Mesopotamians. They are heavily influential on our society today. Even something and things they did 5,000 years ago. Pretty crazy. This is a Sumerian writing chart. You see pictographs, ideograms, and the phonetic signs. This is sort of an evolution of how you have the Mesopotamian pictographs, this cuneiform, which eventually transforms into ideograms, which are, the pictographs are an actual picture, which represents an item. Hills represent mountains. The triangle represents a woman. A triangle and hills represent a woman from across the mountains, which is a slave woman, because she's a woman that we probably captured from another tribe. Water, wavy lines. Okay. Ideogram is that because the picture represents an idea. Think of it this way. The pictograph is more like a word. An ideogram is more like a sentence. A single picture that represents an entire complete sentence or idea, for instance. And then the phonetic signs is where we actually start giving sound to the words, where we actually start to see the first sound matching the words. Again, like what sound matches water? I mean, water is a word. But our language today is a phonetic language. A, B, S, D, E. I mean, our letters, our alphabet have phonetic. They actually have sounds to them, and they have meanings to them. So individual letters, the alphabet, which we don't come along with the alphabet for a while. But it gives you an idea how pictographs, the earliest type of language, written language, eventually moves forward into our modern language. And you'll see even I think I have a better chart of this. You'll see as well. It's really interesting how this works. All right. We're going to move on to, I believe we're going to move to Egypt next. But your book has got more information, more stuff. If you're interested, read more about that. Here you see Mesopotamia. And again, we could talk the entire class about Mesopotamia. Very interesting. But, look online. You can find a ton of information about it. This is Sumeria, Akkad, which was the Akkadian Empire, Assyria. You have Syria, Phoenicia over here. Also, this is sometimes called the area of Canaan. It's later on what will become, this is modern-day Israel. This is modern-day Turkey. Iraq is in here. India over here. So, Mesopotamia, this is Tigris and Euphrates. We see some of the earliest cities, Uruk and Ur right there. And that Gilgamesh, he was the king of Uruk. Probably the year, somewhere in like the year 2700s. There's actually evidence that he was a real king. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't pretending to be a god. He didn't go and fight gods and stuff like that as he did in the epic, but he was probably a real king. That's the thing, most mythological stories are based in some form of reality. There's usually some reality that begins these stories. All right, now we will look at Egypt and the pharaohs. So around the same time as empire building was occurring in Mesopotamia, we have a unified empire develop in the Nile River Valley in Egypt, probably around 3100 as well. Bear in mind, in all these situations, this is when like an empire or a civilization develops, which means there have been people living there in small towns and villages and communities for thousands of years in most cases. It isn't like these people just showed up. They've been there forever, for who knows how long, but it's not really until we have an actual written record that we start considering these a civilization, and we really start considering these a society of note. After all, until we have a written record, there's really nothing to talk about. So, all right, Nile and the God King. Regular flooding of the Nile happened just like Tigris and Euphrates. The mountains would melt, the snow would melt in Central Africa, all that snow would run down, the rivers would flood, and the same kind of thing, bringing all the soil and dirt and nutrients, and you had this very fertile river valley going all the way to the Mediterranean Ocean. Every year they would come with new soil, nutrients, and fresh water. They built large irrigation projects, the same thing. The king was often seen as a god king. They were very religious. Religion was very secondary in Mesopotamia. You had the priests at the top, but their entire society wasn't really governed by religion. It was really more governed by law and king, and there was certainly religion, and people believed in gods, but it wasn't front and center. In Egypt, religion was the entire society. Their whole society revolved around their religious beliefs. Culture and religion and government and law, everything revolved around their religious beliefs. The king was seen as a god king. They really weren't called pharaohs at first. Pharaohs really come about 1,000 years later. Well, far later, before they start calling them pharaohs. At first, they were probably just a warlord king. The river also served as a highway, which generally unified all of Egypt. There was an Upper Egypt and a Lower Egypt, which unified it. Allowed Egypt to become like this one large, long state. Basically, the entire state just ran along the sides of the Nile River for 50 miles in each direction, give or take. Very strong tradition about life and death. They believed in the afterlife, and it was tied into the river because the river would bring life every single year. Because if that river didn't flood, if the Nile did not flood, that was it. Egyptian society would end. So basically the entire society was revived every year when the waters came. So their entire society was based upon this cyclical cycle of rebirth, renewal, death that happened on an annual basis every single year. Early unification of Egypt was known as the Old Kingdom. This was probably one of the most prosperous eras, which really developed everything we think of as Egyptian culture, art, and religious belief. Pretty much all of it developed in the Old Kingdom and then survives for the next couple thousand years. That's one unique thing about Egyptian culture. We have civilization in Egypt for 3,000 years before it's finally conquered by the Romans. Culture in Egypt doesn't really change. For thousands of years, what it means to be Egyptian is pretty much unchanging. That is really unique in the world. So what it meant to be Egyptian in 3000 BCE wasn't really different than what it was in 1000 BCE. Egypt maintained very polytheistic, very, very strong religious beliefs, meaning many gods, polytheistic. They had a whole pantheon of gods, and they had a whole hierarchy of gods. Just like human society was broken up into hierarchical society of the kings and priests and the warriors and the middle class and the poor and the slaves. The gods were the same way. You had high gods, you had lower rank gods, you had demigods, which were like part human, part god, and you had all that in between. Some of their mightiest gods were Amun, which was the god of sky, the creator of the universe, maybe the one god, the high god. You had Ra, who was a god of sun god who brought life to the land. You have Osiris and Isis, who are brother and sister. Also, I think they were lovers, who I think they were married, brother, sister. That wasn't uncommon back then. I know we're talking about gods here, but even among humans, especially among royalty and elite, they were all very concerned about bloodlines, maintaining the pure blood of the elite. So it was not uncommon for family members to marry and to have kids together to keep the blood pure. That was actually a common thing in much of world history for thousands of years. So Osiris and Isis were lovers, husband and wife. He died every year. Osiris would die every year, and Isis would revive him, bring him back to life every spring, which represented the Nile. Again, everything dies in the winter, and then every spring the water comes and brings everything back to life. So the whole life of Isis and Osiris really represented the entire cyclical life of the Egyptians, all revolving around the Nile River. Very interesting stuff. The pharaoh, again, pharaoh is a term that comes about later, but he was sort of a god king. It's really not always obvious. At times, the pharaoh was actually portrayed as a god, maybe a god in mortal form. Other times, he's portrayed as a mortal who simply talks to the gods or communicates with the gods. So either way, the pharaoh is incredibly powerful, incredibly influential, and is either in touch with the gods, or part god himself, or even a god in mortal form. And everything believed in this idea of the afterlife. In later centuries, we see the Book of the Dead, which is, contrary to the mummy movies, it's not something crazy. It just was like an instruction manual. That's another thing about religion in Egyptian society. In our modern religion, you look at many modern religious beliefs, there's like scripture, there's stories, there's parables. I mean, much of like the Christian Bible is mostly stories. There's stories about how to live your life and in relationships and how to interact with different peoples, what is right, what's wrong. Egyptian society wasn't like that. The Egyptian religion is really more about a law code, a rule book. The Book of the Dead was basically an instruction manual. Their religious scripture was an instruction on how to get to the afterlife, how to prepare the body, the rituals to use, the oils to use, the different things you had to say, the incense you had to burn, the animals you had to sacrifice, etc., etc. Their religion was much more practical. It was really about the practical rules of living a religious life, obeying the religious laws and rituals so as to enter the afterlife, the next life. Very interesting kind of stuff. Of course, mummies, everyone's familiar with mummies, taught you how to mummify bodies and, all that kind of thing. Really interesting how their society, and they maintain this type of culture for thousands of years. So we have social divisions and work in ancient Egypt. At the top, of course, were the pharaohs, priests, and the nobles. Below them were the Egyptian scribes. They typically were well-off families. It was a full-time career to learn how to be a scribe. It took years to master. They wrote on papyrus. Papyrus is a plant that was, I don't know how it was prepared. Basically, it was made into these flat sheets of like paper that they would then roll up into scrolls. The language they spoke was hieroglyphs. It is a form of ideogram, to where the image isn't just a picture of something. Each picture actually represents an idea, a thought, like an entire sentence or group of sentences, these ideograms, these what we call hieroglyphs. You'll see some examples of those on the next slide. You can see a little bit right here, a couple hieroglyphs. Year-round agriculture, that was the main occupation in Egypt. Good climate, really good climate along the Nile because of the water. Was good growing seasons. not a lot of cold or rain. Very rich soil, for the reasons we already talked about. Livestock production, lots of livestock, animals, domestication of animals, and of course fish. Fish was a major part of their diet as well. Egyptians typically lived in very modest homes, small family groups. Usually their homes were, again, small, single family, with little prayer areas. Prayer is the wrong word. Little shrines. They had shrines to the gods. They didn't do prayer like we would think of necessarily, but shrines to most families had their own little personal god that they would worship. Marriage took place at a very young age, but of course you got to understand this time period. People usually, life expectancy was 30 years old for a typical common person. So people married young, they had children young. By the time you were 12, 13, 14 years old, you were often already starting a family or preparing to start a family at that age. So marriages were often arranged. It wasn't about love. Marriages were arranged for purposes, whatever, societal purposes, etc. No real currency, no real money either. Not until much later in Egyptian society, but in early part, the Old Kingdom didn't really have money. They paid everything in produce, food, agriculture, I should say, or labor. There's often been a belief that the pyramids were primarily built by slaves. We actually don't think that now. We actually believe pyramids were primarily built by the workers, the farmers, in the off-season, when they weren't actually tending to the crops, which was only about half the year. The other half of the year, they would do odd jobs, they would do labor, they would build things. So they paid their taxes year-round by agriculture part of the year and labor the other part of the year. That's how they would work for the state. An image here of Egyptian home life. So based upon facial expressions in the painting, what conclusions can you draw? Think about it for a moment. They don't look unhappy. They don't look like there's any type of unhappiness. You have husbands, wives, children in this. Now, certainly, as in even today's society, how many people get a portrait painted of their family? It's pretty rare. These folks were obviously high status family. You have male, females. You have, looks like, maybe 4 children in this. Notice how they drew children as basically little mini humans. They were not proportional exactly. Males, females, you can see in the imagery. You can tell the difference between the male and the female for obvious ways. Generally relaxed, taking care of each other, grooming each other, just some type of activities. The children are running around and playing. Yeah, it seems that type of a life, that possibly family relationships were relaxed and intimate, and nudity didn't mean anything. Truthfully, until modern times, nudity really doesn't mean much in most societies. We have a very different view of the human body in modern times than humans have for almost all of human history. As far as we can tell, the human body was nothing people were really concerned or ashamed about. It was just the human body, meant nothing. The idea of nudity is almost a modern construct, really. If you wore clothes, for almost all of human history, it was utilitarian, it was for a purpose. And if it was hot outside and you weren't working in the fields or something, and you didn't need to have clothes on, you wouldn't have clothes on. It just didn't matter. All right. Again, why would you have this painted? Well, probably have it painted because you have money, wealth, status, stuff like that. Commoners wouldn't have had this done. Commoners couldn't have had something like this done. This is probably a grave image of some sort, maybe on a tomb. And of course, you see the hieroglyphs. Lots of hieroglyphs are all on the top right here. So it tells us a lot. And of course, if you read the translation in your book might actually give you a translation of what this is in your textbook, perhaps. It tells you. And then you can see the hieroglyphs next to each person. So that's almost like, I don't know if it's like a little text bubble where it's sort of like what they're saying or what they're doing. Yeah. It tells us a lot. Of all early civilizations, we probably know more about the Egyptians than any other. Truthfully, of the earliest ones, probably the Egyptians, because there's just so much left. Because they put everything on stone and papyrus in a dry place, kept away from the elements, can survive thousands of years. So, again, I'm sure they didn't create it meaning it to last like that, but nonetheless it did. This was of the Egyptian god Bastet. Cats were sacred in Egyptian society. It was a capital offense to kill or injure certain cats. So cats were held in high esteem. This might have been a religious figure in a home, part of your shrine, to a family that worshipped Bastet. I don't know if I've really shown an image of it yet, but in the Egyptians, the gods are always represented as humans with an animal head. So if there was an imagery of Bastet, she would have probably been shown with a cat head. So, but that was sort of the Egyptian religion. Everybody, there was, it is almost animistic in a way. The sand, the dirt, the wind, the moon, the sky, the water, the trees, everything had gods associated with them, gods or spirits. So, all right, migrations and political revivals. So somewhere around 1800 BCE, we see a new people actually move into the northern part of Egypt. We call them the Hyksos. They come in probably around 1800, and they bring bronze with them. This is sort of the beginning of the Bronze Age. You can see some bronze weapons here. Bronze is an alloy. It's a mixture of copper and tin, and it's actually quite strong. And the Hyksos come in. They probably bring chariots with them. Teaching the Egyptians, teaching them by, of course, being defeated by them. The Hyksos actually come in and defeat the Egyptians. But in the process, usually even if you're the loser in a battle, you learn the new technologies. Now that they've used chariots, later on, we'll see the Egyptians use chariots. Now that the Hyksos bring bronze into Egypt, which Egypt was still probably in the sort of the Neo Stone Age, they were still using bone and stone and things like this. Wood, so they bring bronze technology and other technologies. They come in around 1800. They have bronze armor, bronze weapons, chariots, using modern bows, for that time period. And they generally really sort of defeat the Egyptians. And they pretty much bring down the first Egyptian empire, the first kingdom, or the old kingdom, bring it down. Egypt breaks up into multiple pieces, into multiple different states. And the Hyksos come in and take over for a while. But what is really interesting, as happens pretty much every time someone invades Egypt, they come into Egypt, they invade, they move in, and then they assimilate into the Egyptian culture. Within a few generations, the Hyksos are Egyptian. They're worshiping the Egyptian gods, they're dressing like Egyptians, they're speaking Egyptian language, they're writing in hieroglyphs. Egyptian culture was so ancient and so ingrained in that part of the world that even when alien peoples came in, instead of bringing their culture with them, they generally assimilated into the Egyptian culture, even if they were the victors in a war. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure they brought some of their own gods, and I'm sure some gods were added onto the pantheon, and there was probably some new traditions brought, but it's really interesting. So this is when we generally move into the Middle Kingdom, this Middle Kingdom period, 2080 to 1640 BCE. Hyksos controlled much of the northern part of Egypt, which is technically Lower Egypt. The northern part is lower, because lower is based on elevation. And upper is in Central Africa, and lower is up at the north where Mediterranean is. So it's Lower Egypt, but it's the northern part of Egypt, is generally where they control the Nile Delta, which flooded out into the Mediterranean Sea. And eventually they basically become Egypt, and this Hyksos empire becomes in essence, it becomes the new Egyptian empire, what we call this Middle Kingdom. And by 1640, the Hyksos don't really even exist as an independent culture. Northern Egypt is just Egypt again. There's really no way to tell a difference. Now, the people in the southern part of Egypt actually established a separate kingdom. They defeated the Hyksos, and after a while, eventually, it extends. They actually extend Egypt further down towards Oh, wow. I don't have it in my notes right now, but I think you'll see it on a map in a minute. They extend Egypt further into Africa, further along the Nile. And this is generally where we start seeing the term pharaoh come about, is in the Middle Kingdom, to where we have these Egyptian god kings, these rulers that are, in this time period, they actually portray themselves as gods. They are actually gods. You can't touch them, you can't be around them, you have to be have special rituals to even be in contact with them. And if anyone breaks the rules, you're instantly killed. You're immediately killed if anyone breaks the rules around the pharaoh, because you are, in essence, interacting with a god. Um, yeah, quite interesting. Slavery was common. For that region of Africa that they moved into, that they start interacting with, is Nubia, which is a little more southern, a little closer, pretty much on the other side of the Sahara Desert. We see lots of war in the Middle Kingdom. Lots of war when the Hyksos come in. After the Hyksos are there, war with the Nubians, war with others. We think this is probably a period where slavery really ramps up, to where there's lots and lots of slaves in Egyptian society. To be clear, in all early societies there were slaves, but it had nothing to do with skin color, nothing to do with race. It was simply you were a slave because you were in debt, or you were a slave because you were you were not a war criminal, but an enemy, prisoner of war, um, or for punishment for crimes. They didn't have prisons back then like we do. You committed a crime back then, if it wasn't all that serious, you simply would be enslaved or indebted to someone for a while. Slavery also wasn't usually permanent, as it became in modern times. All right, and we get the New Kingdom from 1570 to 1075. The New Kingdom spread, contacted other empires, including the Hittites. I don't know if I have Hittites on the thing here, if we'll see Hittites in a moment. But they run into the Hittites, which are basically from the region of Anatolia. Anatolia is Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. All those are the same. Asia Minor, Turkey, modern-day Turkey, and the region of Anatolia. It's all the same region. Basically, it's that little region where just on the other side of it is Europe, and you head up towards Russia, up in that region there. Hittites started using a new technology. So by the year 1000, we have a new technology being brought in, iron. Now we start to usher in the Iron Age. Now, officially, Bronze Age is usually around, give or take, 2000 BCE, 1500, and then Iron is usually 500 to 1000. So about 1,500 years later, on average. That is an average number. You can find regions that use iron hundreds of years different. So the age is sort of fluid, because some societies use iron centuries before others. Same thing with bronze, etc. The Hittites used iron weapons, iron swords, iron arrow tips. This is iron down here, iron axe heads, making them very formidable, very tough enemies to fight. Eventually, they make peace around 1300. And after that, they make peace. They settle some of them settle in northern Egypt. They become Egyptian. But then just a century after that, we have more enemies come in. And by the year 1000, pretty much the entire region of northern Egypt was ensconced in warfare, violence, destruction, burning cities. So much of the last couple hundred years of the Three Kingdoms, ending with the New Kingdom, Egypt is dealing with violence. But you must understand, as a normal person, as an average person, life didn't really change much. Egypt in 1000 was pretty much Egypt in 3000. Not much different. Culturally, politically, socially, everything was pretty much the same. This did allow Egypt, though, to advance technologically. They continued to advance religiously, because we do see different religions come in. But Egypt is Egypt. In the after year 1000, everything changes, but we'll talk about that later. We start seeing everything change around the Mediterranean. And Egypt is a Mediterranean civilization. They're really not an African civilization. Even though the population was African, Egypt is, some scholars actually lump Egypt in with Mediterranean and Europe and the Middle East. Because truthfully, culturally, technologically, religiously, Egypt is more closely aligned with European societies and Middle Eastern societies than African societies. And that's because of one thing, probably the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert covers most northern Africa, and basically it's an impenetrable barrier between Egypt along the coast and the entire rest of the continent. Only way to get across it is the Nile. And the Nile is a very narrow path, so yeah, so you see the Nile Delta here, the Mediterranean. So as I said, often Egypt is really more closely associated with the Mediterranean, Europe, and the Middle East. Okay, here we have Mesopotamia over here. You have the Egyptian civilization here, all along the Nile River. Here we have Nubia up here. You see some of the kingdoms over Hittites. Hittites come from Anatolia, Asia Minor right here. Hittites, Hittite homeland, the Old Kingdom. New Kingdom was much greatly expanded as they went to war with Nubia. Babylon, I didn't really talk about Babylon. And we will, I believe we start in the next chapter, we'll talk about the Greeks. We'll start talking about the Greek civilization, which is the Mycenaeans. That's the beginning of Greek civilization. You can see the Hyksos, which came in here from this region of Palestine and Phoenicia. You can see the Sea Peoples, which I haven't really talked about that. Sometime around the year 1000, 1200 to 1000, the entirety of this region was covered in warfare, violence, and destruction. And a lot of it is blamed on the Sea People. Who are the Sea People? I think it's this generic term really referring to all the different migrating peoples, which would migrate from area A to B, and then when they go into B, they would actually push the people in B over to C, and then they push the people in C over to D, and this really is almost like dominoes, and this causes constant conflicts and violence. Egypt also had a target painted on it. For so many years, hundreds of years, Egypt was in isolation, but yet it grew powerful, wealthy. I mean, massive pyramids and treasure and gold. It accumulated massive wealth, probably the most wealthy empire in this region. That draws people to you. It makes a target out of you. Makes people want to come and take your shit. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? More stuff you got, the more other people covet it. And with this expansion of warfare and all kinds of new weapons technology, bronze and iron, we go from a period where most people are using stone and wood and bone to 1,000 years later, they're using iron, which is powerful. All this new technology made warfare much easier, using horses as weapons, chariots, and all kinds of other stuff. Yeah, really changed a lot of things. All right, and I think our last thing we'll talk about is, we'll end the chapter. Again, I'm skipping the stuff in the book. There's some other stuff in the book which is really interesting, but I only can cover so much. I do this lecture exactly like I do a class lecture. This lecture will only take an hour and a half. If this were in class, it'd be 2.5 hours. Because in class, I take your questions. You ask questions, you raise your hand, etc., etc. And so an hour and a half lecture, me just talking, is 2.5 hours in class. So this is a typical class lecture. So I have to do it, and I do it in that way. I do what we're doing here exactly the same as class. I don't add extra material just because it's online. This would be just like a normal class lecture, only quite a bit slower because all of you would be asking me questions. And we would having, every time I show pictures, we'd have class discussion. What does it mean? Like that picture of the Egyptian family, we'd spend 10, 15 minutes talking about that. All the different things it meant and all the things that it could have been and what they were doing and blah, blah, blah. But we don't end up talking about all that. So this goes quite a bit quicker. So we will move on into the Hebrews. These are another people that came to be very important during the declining years of the Egyptians. These people had a lasting legacy, especially for us in America and the West. Much longer lasting legacy than the Egyptians, broadly speaking. The Hebrews, the Jews. All right. So the Hebrew people were nomadic for most of their history. There was only a few periods that they actually had an established society, an established civilization. Now, they had every aspect of civilization other than like established cities, which they did have at times. So they fully fulfill the role of civilization. They were a civilized, educated people. For most of their history, they actually transmitted all their stories, all their religious beliefs, their rules. Their entire history was transmitted orally. It was actually one of the most important roles of the male members of the family, the heads of the families, to basically memorize and remember all this. And of course, they had an entire dedicated, I guess we call clergy, which was a religious organization that was dedicated to remembering and rehearsing and saying all these stories and all of this religious belief. And they probably did this for over 2,000 years before they were actually able to write it all down. So they were often nomadic, pastoralists, goat herders, sheep herders. They probably entered the Nile Delta, Egypt, probably around the 15th century BCE, and they were enslaved by the Egyptians. They were enslaved by the Egyptians till around 1300 BCE, Moses. And there's actually a lot of evidence that Moses was a real person. Now, whether you believe everything else about the religious aspects of it, that's up to you. But was Moses a real person? Probably. And he was one of their leaders. He led them out of Egypt. This is what we call the Exodus. He basically led the entire Hebrew peoples out of Egypt, supposedly parting the Red Sea, crossing over into the Sinai Peninsula, I believe, which is a little bitty peninsula, a little triangle. I probably have it on a map. Well, actually, see if it shows it right here. Yeah, you can see it. Red Sea here. So somewhere in this area, across the Red Sea, in this little triangle piece right here, that's the Sinai Peninsula. This is where Mount Sinai is. It's where we'll get to the Ten Commandments and the burning bush and the Mount Sinai and all that. That was right here. So he led them out of Egypt sometime, give or take, 1300s. These dates are not exact. They're a little questionable. We know it happened in this time period, that the Egyptians did escape captivity in Egypt, but the actual year is a little harder to be accurate on, but somewhere in this time period. Eventually leading them to Palestine, which is up here. So eventually leading them out of Egypt, across the Red Sea, into the Sinai Peninsula. He receives the Ten Commandments there, eventually leading them up into Palestine, where they do form a state. For a few years, for a couple centuries, we do have an actual Jewish state. Until modern times, that's it. This state that they form in Palestine, they're about to form, is pretty much the only time the Egyptian people have ever had an actual state until modern times, until, 70-some years ago, 67 years ago. So, Egyptian enslavement, Moses, the Exodus, 13th, 14th century BCE, leads them into Palestine. This is what the Jews believe is their ancestral homeland. They believe this is where they came from centuries earlier, this region of what is the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, modern-day Israel and modern-day Palestine, Palestine, and the entire eastern coast of the Mediterranean. They were under the military leadership of two figures you've probably heard of, Saul and then David later. They brought all the tribes together. They called themselves different tribes. And they do form this state around the year 1000, give or take. You see the dates on the slide here. They defeat an enemy known as the Philistines, which were probably the Canaanites. The Canaanites were the people that lived in the region of Palestine before the Jews showed up. The Jews form armies under the leadership of, Saul and David were basically generals, warlords. Of course, following the words of God. And they wage war on the Philistines. They conquer the city of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem becomes their religious center. His son, this is David's son, I believe. David's son, which is Solomon. These were the first three great kings of the Jewish state. Solomon builds a temple of Jerusalem, which supposedly houses the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, again, is also thought to be a real thing. Not at all like, the Indiana Jones movies, but the Ark of the Covenant was simply a box or a container that held the holy relics of the Jews. It held holy scriptures, holy relics. It contained, basically, it was a storage container for religious artifacts. And it probably was there in the Temple of Jerusalem before it was eventually burned down and destroyed. Not once, but twice. Eventually, twice. Solomon dies. The state, this new Jewish state, which is an empire, really, because an empire is when you defeat other enemies and take their land from them, and basically forcefully overthrow them or conquer them, which is what the Jews did to the Philistines. Which was probably the Canaanites. They overtook them and militarily dominated them. So they were effectively an empire. So they formed the state sometime after the death of Solomon. It actually separates into two different states, two different kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So we now have two separate Jewish states. Sometime around the year, these dates are all, they're all circa, circa meaning around. Sometimes circa the years 800, 900, we see two different Jewish states, Israel and Judah. Eventually, this led to their downfall. This infighting among the Jews, this division among the Jews, weakened them. Again, anything divided in half is half as strong. And so what happens is now they are two weaker Jewish states led by separate kings, and they're easy pickings. They were never big in the first place. They were never large empires. They were quite small. So the Assyrians eventually conquer, the north. Yeah, the northern Israel region is conquered by the Assyrians. And eventually the southern region is conquered by the Babylonians. So the Babylonians conquer part of the Jewish state, and the Assyrians conquer the other part. The Babylonian captivity, the southern Jewish population, they were actually enslaved and taken back to Babylon. Babylon is over around those regions of Uruk and Ur. It's Mesopotamia. Babylon is a Mesopotamian civilization. This might actually be Neo-Babylon. You don't need to worry about the difference there. It's the new Babylonian civilization, because there was an old Babylonian civilization 1,000 years before this. So these are the Neo-Babylonians, I think. Doesn't matter. But this new Babylonian civilization takes them into captivity, hauls them back to Babylon, which is in Mesopotamia, and they're slaves there for many years. The dates we have here is about 40-some years. They're basically slaves of the Babylonians. Again, this is not uncommon. So what happened to the Jews is standard practice. When one enemy conquered another enemy, they usually took them as slaves. Standard practice. There's nothing unusual about this. It's happened all across the world, everywhere. So eventually they do escape out of Babylon. They do escape. They go back to Jerusalem. They don't ever necessarily take over Jerusalem, but they do go back to Jerusalem, and they try to establish a semblance of order in life, even though they don't really ever establish another empire or state ever again. Well, what happens almost immediately when they get back to Jerusalem is the very next, literally within decades, they're conquered by the Persians. So other than a 200-ish year period, 300 maybe, so 200 to 300 year period when the Jewish people actually had their own society, their own civilization, their own state, for pretty much the entirety of Jewish life before and after that, they were subservient to some other people, subservient to the Egyptians, to the Babylonians, to the Romans, to the Greeks. For pretty much all their history, they were under the thumb of some other much more powerful state. So as soon as they get back into Israel in the 500s, they're almost immediately back to Jerusalem, conquered by the Persians from Central Asia. And then Persia maintains control over Jerusalem for the next 200-ish years. And then the Greeks come in and conquer it. And then it's under the authority of some Greek ruler for 200-ish years. And then the Romans come in and conquer it. And then it's under the authority of the Romans for several centuries. So on and so forth. This gives you an idea here. Solomon's kingdom was all of this. And then we see it actually broken sometime after Solomon's death. It's broken into two separate kingdoms. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Then eventually Judah is conquered by the Babylonians who were over here, and they're hauled off to Babylon. I'm sure they didn't haul off every one of them, but a lot of them. And then Israel up here is conquered by the Assyrians, which are up here from Western Asia. They come in and conquer them. And here we have these years. Solomon established the first real state around 950, and it only lasts 150 years. And then it collapses into two separate states, and then in a very short period of time, both of these states are conquered by others. And here we have the Exodus out, crossing the Red Sea, over here, Mount Sinai, where Moses got the Ten Commandments, and possible. We actually do have a mount there called Mount Sinai. There's actually a mountain called Mount Sinai, but is that the mountain that Moses supposedly went up and spoke to God? Not positive. Whether, and the timetable of all this is sketchy. Most of this timetable could be 50, 100 years, one way or the other. And even the order of events is not 100%, because there's an order of events in Jewish scripture that doesn't necessarily always match up with the historical evidence. But it's not something, it's discussed, it's not something hotly debated, because, we don't want to really necessarily challenge Jewish scripture. Jewish people believe very strongly in their timeline. Historically, it doesn't always match up. But that's okay, because historically, pretty much all of it does, there's evidence that all of it happened. I mean, they were in captivity in Babylon. They were in captivity in Egypt. They did go along, or they were near the Red Sea. They did cross into Mount Sinai and the Sinai Peninsula, and, they were enslaved in all of this. So the evidence for most of it does actually match historical records of other civilizations. One of the reasons we know this is we were able to match up all the stuff in Jewish scripture. Most of it we're able to match up with records we have in Egypt, records we have in the Canaan region, records we have in Babylon, and records we have of the Romans and the Greeks and the Persians, which talk about these people. The Jewish religion, Judaism. Hebrews formed their own writings, their own teachings, their own history, their own practices, their own beliefs. The Jewish Bible. The first part, which is known as the Torah, typically, and this is also represented in the Christian Bible, the Old Testament. The Torah is represented in the Old Testament as well. They became known as the Jewish people, and they follow this religion of Judaism. The God is Yahweh. It's the same God. Christian God, Jewish God, Muslim God. It's all the same God. Everyone again, Christianity accepts that their Christian God, then Jewish God's the same. Muhammad accepted that the Christian God, the Jewish God was the same God. It just, each time they say that they have a better understanding. When Jesus comes along, Jesus has a better understanding of God, a more proper understanding. Muhammad comes along 600 years later, 550 years later. Muhammad has a more proper understanding of God. So it's the same God. And truthfully, if you actually look at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they're more similar than different. They really are. These are all three world religions which have, as their core tenets, a lot of similarities. And each one each one writes in their scripture that they owe to the previous ones. So truthfully, these religions have more in common, honestly, than really different. What made the Jews different? Probably more than anything, they were, don't get me wrong, at one point, a couple thousand years ago, they were polytheistic like everyone else. Jews were polytheistic at one time. All peoples were polytheistic. But then sometime in the late 1000s, like close to 2000 BC, somewhere in that time period. The date isn't, no one knows for sure. The Jewish leaders believed that they would be able to have greater control and authority and create greater cohesion among their peoples if they focused all their efforts on one God. And so they are the world's first monotheistic religion. But to be perfectly clear, Jews were polytheistic, completely polytheistic, and then at some point, probably before Egyptian captivity, or somewhere in that time period, they converted and became monotheistic, believing just one God, one deity. And they are the first religion in the world to choose to devote their beliefs to one deity. The first monotheistic religion, of which several follow. Christianity, Islam, monotheistic. According to this Torah, there was this agreement that was formed between Yahweh and the Hebrews. Specifically, this covenant really comes about with Moses. This is the agreement made with Moses and God, and this is known as the covenant. It's quite complicated, but in its most simple form, God says the Jews are his chosen people, and he will protect them from all enemies, and in exchange, they will worship one God, just him, the one chosen God. That's the covenant, which comes about, again, sometime around this time in Egypt. Is either right before or right after is when they switch from polytheistic to monotheistic and worship the one God. In this covenant, this agreement between Yahweh and the Jewish people, you worship only me, and I will protect you, and you will be my chosen people. Let's go back. There we go. There was a list of laws identified. Everybody's familiar with the Ten Commandments. This was given to Moses by Yahweh to maintain this basically religious and civil behavior. Again, this was probably written by the Jewish leaders, the Jewish leadership, to basically keep their people in line. One of the reasons the need for this was because the Jews are being pulled in every direction. They were constantly being bombarded by alien cultures, alien religious beliefs, and it's generally believed by historians that the reason for this, the reason for the creation of the covenant, the reason for the worship of one God, and this writing down all their religious writings in the Torah and other religious scriptures is to create compliance and to protect their culture, to create a very concrete culture requiring absolute compliance to keep the Jewish people from basically just disappearing, being blended into all the other alien cultures they were interacting with, which happened to most people. And we talk about like what Hyksos did. The Hyksos move into Egypt, and in 100 years, there's no Hyksos. They have become Egyptian. The Jews feared this happening. The Jews feared that one of these times they were going to be captured or assimilated into another culture, and their culture was going to simply disappear. So they feared this, and this is one of the reasons of creating the commandments, creating the rules, the scripture, the religious laws. And much of the Torah is religious law, and policies and beliefs and rules, sort of what to do. The Ten Commandments: don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't covet your neighbor's wife, etc. It was a moral religion, and it also taught that if you did all these things right, it would create prosperity, it would create hope, it would create authority, it would create protection for the Jews. So why wouldn't you want to be Jewish? Why wouldn't you want to follow these rules, and then you get all of the benefits from Yahweh, you get all the protections? It also was interesting in that the rules of the Torah, I hope I'm not saying it incorrectly, applied to everybody. That's another thing which we think was put in there purposefully, because every society the Jews dealt with was stratified to where the rich had things and the poor didn't, and there were slaves, and the Jewish people said, no, everybody's the same. Everybody gets treated the same. If you're Jewish, we are all going to be like basically one extended family. To make it appealing to the people, to where you have more status, more importance with us than if the Jews were among the Babylonians or the Egyptians or somewhere else. They were treated as commoners or slaves. They were treated like shit. But if you stay among the Jews, you're going to be treated properly, respectfully. Yeah. And this could be debated on, and it still is debated. Let's see what else you want to talk about that. That's it on that slide. All right. The family in Jewish life, originally nomadic, but after taking Jerusalem in the 10th century, they started to live in cities. They started to be a lot more urban, at least as urban was in the 10th century BCE. They built walls, they built palaces, they built public buildings. And again, for the better part of 200-300 years, the Jews were largely city people. They built temples, they built religious structures, they built places for prayer, they built storehouses and palaces and walls and public buildings, and they were urbanized for a while. Family marriage was very important. Marriages were typically arranged. You couldn't trust children. Family and marriage life was decided for you. This was nothing about love. Decisions were made. It was a very patriarchal society as well. The men had all the authority. The men are the only ones who read. And in this time period, men were the only ones that typically were able to read the religious scriptures. And then the men were expected to then take care of the family, to share the family, and to be the sort of the moral guidepost for the family. Childbearing and increasing population was probably the most important job for women. Childbearing, it was actually seen as a religious function. I don't know if you've ever heard the terminology, like this idea of be fruitful and multiply. Well, this was a very significant, very important for the Jewish population. And the reason, of course, made sense. They were so small, and they were constantly dominated by larger alien populations, that they wanted the Jewish population to grow, to be strong, to be powerful as quickly as possible. They never reached a large population. Ancestral properties were to be maintained through male heirs, family bloodlines. It was a patriarchal society. Male children were preferred, and of course, God was seen as a man. Yahweh was seen as a male. So male-dominated authority became standard in social, cultural, and religious life in Jewish society. Jewish economic opportunities. As they adapted to city life, they adapted to crafting and trade, baskets, pottery, baking, stuff like this they adapted to. We see many Jewish people becoming merchants, traders, business people, very common. Of course, they were in the perfect location. We'll talk about this in other chapters, but I mean, this location in what we today call the Middle East was perfect. You were at the center of everything. What we will call later, I'll reference the ancient Silk Roads. These roads which crisscrossed from Asia into Europe and Africa, and the Jewish people were right there. They were right in the middle of it. So it's not surprising that they became business people and lenders of money, and eventually they become bankers and merchants of all types. Not surprising at all. They had the largest empire in the world right next to them, Persia. At one point, Persia does become, probably around the time they take over the Jewish lands in the 5th, 6th century BCE. Persia is the greatest empire in the world, hands down. So it's not surprising that they were business people dealing with the Persians. Study of religious texts was very important. The men did this. The male Jews were the ones that did the study of religious texts. They were typically the only ones that were literate. Their entire society was tied to observing religious texts. Everything, society, culture, religion, business, everything pretty much was about centered around the religious texts. Their religious writings and scriptures was their law, it was their culture, it was their religion, all tied into one. Now, women might have had greater economic opportunities in Jewish culture. Even though they had limited opportunities culturally, religiously, perhaps, economically, we know that women often took a very important role in running businesses and shops and as merchants. Probably because the male leaders, were so busy studying the religious texts and scripture. If you were a proper Jewish male, you would have been reading the religious scriptures every day, like every day of the week. So, yeah, women probably had greater roles in the family, at home, and in businesses. Women might even run shops, merchant stalls, run businesses possibly. Yeah, very interesting. Because the men were so busy and so focused on the religious scriptures and how religion pretty much encircled their entire way of life, this actually gave women more opportunities, as long as it had nothing to do with religious aspects. Really interesting. And that's a very, very brief overview of the early Jewish society. So I think that actually ends what we're going to talk about in this chapter. So there's some good questions that are in this chapter, some good things I can think of, some comparisons, some contrast stuff between, lots of good ideas here for discussion questions, comparison, contrast between the Egyptians and the Jewish populations, Mesopotamians. Yeah, lots of good stuff in this. Anyway, that is it, and thanks so much. We'll see you in class.